Hi, everyone. We'll wait for 1 more minute. People are still arriving. So it's 3:02. I think people will still be arriving, but I do propose that we start. So welcome, everyone. Welcome to the debate, the Frugal 4 and the European Fiscal Rules, Discipline or Expansion, which is being organized by the Sustainable Finance Lab, the New Economics Foundation, and the Vienna Institute for International Economic Studies. So this debate today is part of the Fiscal Matters Week of Debates, and Fiscal Matters is a group of civil society organizations, think tanks, and trade union leaders. And we've organized this week because we think that all too often important policy decisions are taken behind closed doors, whereas we think we need an open and accessible debate on Europe's fiscal future because it's such an important issue. So here we are. This debate, for your knowledge, will be recorded and also added to the Fiscal Matters YouTube channel, as well as actually all the other debates that are part of the Week of Debate. My name is Sarah. I work for the Sustainable Finance Lab, and I'll be today's moderator. You are, of course, also part of the discussion, dear attendees. If you have any questions to our speakers, which I will introduce shortly, you can ask them through the Q&A tab. And if you like a question a lot, you can also endorse it by the thumbs up. And then we will make a selection on behalf of you during the discussion, and I'll take those questions on board. So the topic of today is the EU fiscal framework, but specifically what's going on in the frugal countries. Perhaps you already know, but just to remind you, a few weeks ago, the frugal countries published a common view in which they state that they are open to a debate, but they do want to stick to a rules-based fiscal framework and also look at fiscal sustainability. And I think it's funny to see the reception of this letter in different countries. So, for example, in my own country, the Netherlands, the heading, the newspaper said, the Dutch want to talk about adjusting the fiscal rules. So quite a positive evaluation of this common view. Whereas Politico, an important European news medium, said, hopes of EU fiscal reform on the rocks after pushback from 8 capitals. So here I think you can see from these headings how political and also politicized this topic is, the EU fiscal framework. So the key question for today is trying to understand the position of the frugal countries. So why are the frugal countries frugal? And what room for maneuver is there actually? And is, for example, a deal with the South possible and under which conditions? So we're going to discuss these and more questions with 4 experts from 4 different frugal countries. We have Alfred Katterl, welcome Alfred, from Austria, who has experienced about everything. He is the head of economic policy at the Austrian Ministry of Finance since 2002, so almost 20 years. And some major activities he was involved in are the negotiations of Austria's EU accession, the Stability and Growth Pact, the bilateral loans to Greece, also the establishment of the European Stability Mechanism, and most recently he was also involved in the Austrian Recovery and Resilience Plan. Then from Sweden we have Monika Arvidsson. She's an economist. She works for the Swedish trade union Confederation, and she's responsible for analysis and policymaking in the field of international macroeconomic, studying topics like globalization, fair working conditions, and a social Europe. Then from Denmark, we have Lisbeth Bech-Nielsen. Very warm welcome, Lisbeth. You're a member of the Danish Parliament on behalf of the Socialist People's Party, and already for 10 years, if I'm correct. And currently, Lisbeth is the spokeswoman on finance, IT, and trade and industry. And then last but certainly not least, Harald Benink from the Netherlands, a professor in banking and finance at Tilburg University, also a member of the Sustainable Finance Lab. And Harald is also the chairman of the European Shadow Financial Regulatory Committee, which analyzes policy issues and produces policy recommendations to improve regulatory policy. So before I give the floor to the speakers, a quick setup for you to know, audience, how this webinar will work. We will start with a keynote speech by Alfred of 10 minutes, and then we will have a discussion with the whole panel in 3 stages. So firstly, we will zoom in on the problems of the European economy. Once we've identified them, we'll move to the second stage, namely discuss possible solutions, how to solve those problems. And thirdly, we're going to zoom in on the national discussion in the Frugal countries so that you really understand what is going on in these 4 respective countries. So before I give the floor to Alfred, maybe I'd like to ask you, Monika, Lisbeth, and Harald, and let me then start with you, Monika. What is your personal engagement in this discussion regarding the topic of the EU fiscal framework?
Well, to begin with, thank you very much for the invitation and the possibility to discuss this issue with you today. Well, my colleagues at ELO and myself, we are foremost participating in the discussion on European fiscal rules, perhaps notably at the national level, but also together with the ETUC, that is the European Trade Union Confederation. And ELO is giving general policy advices and recommendations towards politics, national politics, and also international politics to areas we have access to it, but also on general comments and recommendations towards the public debate on what is needed to promote high employment and sustainable growth. Being a member of the EU, but not the Eurozone, gives Sweden a quite special, but also an essential interest to take active part in this discussion, let alone the very fact that our common commitment to strive for a social Europe, where setting the right economic framework is quite essential. So that will be my first take on how we participate, and I participate generally in the debate.
Thanks a lot, Monika. That's very interesting to hear. And what about you, Lisbeth? Can you say something about your political activities in Denmark?
Obviously, I'm interested in this subject, and thank you so much for inviting me. Obviously, I'm interested in this subject because it concerns all of us, and from my political point of view and my party's political point of view, we are interested in how we can turn the subject towards a more people and planet driven approach. We will discuss obviously in details what we need, what we think should be done. But as a member of a party that came from a position of being very anti-EU to having a much more positive approach, we have also been on a journey considering the fiscal matters of the EU. But maintained a critical approach to the tools, the way we treat our neighbors in the European Union, the inequality between North and South, East and West, and for me, that's just one of the most important things to discuss, and also to try to make more approachable for the people in Denmark. For many, this is a very technical issue. It's a very distant issue. So it's important to try to bring it more down to earth and saying that this influences all of us, and it's important for all of us to be engaged in that decision on how we want to live together in European Union, and what kind of fiscal and economic framework we can agree on.
Thanks, that's very insightful, and also good to hear that I guess the red thread of today will also be more convergence between the North and South and how we're going to achieve that. That might be a common interest. Harald, how about yourself, stemming from a country which currently doesn't have a government, but where a lot of things are happening?
Yes, well, thank you very much. Nice to be here. I think this is an excellent initiative. Later during the discussion, we'll see also, I guess, to what extent, what are the difference in levels of frugality between the countries, because I think the countries are there differences? Of course, like Denmark and Sweden are not part of the Eurozone, but they were part of these discussions and under the umbrella of the Hanseatic League, which is quite interesting, chaired by the Dutch Minister of Finance, Wopke Hoekstra. But I think there are important differences between countries. I'm a professor of banking and finance at Tilburg University, so I'm very much interested in this. This committee of professors I'm chairing, we started as a banking regulation committee, but during the past 5 years, we have done a lot of work on Eurozone fragilities. And as we will discuss later, we have been highlighting well before the Corona crisis that the fragilities were so huge in the Eurozone. Well, the crisis we had last year and that we had to set up the Corona Rescue Fund was not a complete surprise. But let us discuss later.
Thanks, and certainly the topic of the Recovery Fund will be on the agenda later. Thank you so much, three of you. I'd like to give the floor now to Alfred for your keynote of approximately 10 minutes.
Thank you very much, Sarah, also for the introduction of my person and of the issue. You rightly said that there were 8 ministers which agreed on a one-pager, on a common letter to the general public on what they think about fiscal policy framework in the future. So it's the Frugal 4 plus at least 4 other member states which share this position, and as you can imagine, we are working to get even more countries on board on that. So as a kind of background, and you can see that the political spectrum, so it's less a political question, because we have in these 8 countries, we have countries from the middle left to the middle right. So it's middle, but I think it's not an ideological question as a principle. If you look at the member states, the headline of this event is discipline or growth or expansion. And I think that the 8 ministers would probably not share that the 2 notions are contradictory. I think we think it's an and. So it's discipline and expansion. They are not in any way contradictory. Why is discipline needed? For one, discipline means that member states should follow commonly chosen rules, and that's SGP in this case. Being disciplined, and Harald mentioned already that there are quite different opinions of what that could mean. Discipline does not mean by itself austerity. It doesn't mean small or inadequate welfare systems. It doesn't mean low or inefficient public infrastructure, poor educational systems. And it also does not mean a lack of counter-cyclical Keynesian, let's say, macro policies, and as is a current theme, it does also not mean an inability to tackle climate change or to raise taxes on the rich. So all these are not demands or requirements by the SGP. There are no obstacles for the member states to pursue their national policies as they see fit. But what is required is that politicians, when they take their decisions, they have to involve those who have to pay for this policy issues or for the policy choices. So the deficit and debt ratio limits in the rules simply mean that you should not spend money now at the expense of those who are not sitting at the negotiating table, probably. That's your children, your grandchildren, or probably your neighboring countries, especially in the Economic and Monetary Union. And I think this principle to take everybody on board, even and also those who have to pay for it, that's also an issue in the climate change debate. And I think there's also this link to what is called time consistency of politics, which basically says that policies should not be disruptive to the framework in which the people live in. So, because if you change the framework all the time, this creates high adjustment costs or overly high adjustment costs. And those adjustment costs hamper economic growth, but also hamper welfare of the people. And this is, in modern growth theory, this is a rather important thing. So this is, I think this is also very important to take into account. But as a matter of fact, public finances reflect national preferences and also problems. But if you look at what's happening in the member states or in the world, then you can see that public deficits mostly reflect unresolved distributional issues. They reflect also an ignorance towards the challenges of the future: aging, greening, pandemics, floods, earthquakes, you name it. This is not taken into account in a proper way. So there's also the issue of bad governance of countries. And the discipline, which is enshrined in the treaty rules, should ensure that all this is taken into account, and that all the problems of a member state do not show up in the deficit as a single indicator. But you could also say that if there's a deficit, this is a sign that the country is not in a political balance. So they don't find solutions where they have put on board both the payers and the beneficiaries of the solutions. And the European dimension of the Stability and Growth Pact is, of course, that this was part of a deal. It was part of the deal to change from the European Community to the European Union. And of course, as Monika said, there's also this issue of the common currency. And as the common currency is irrevocable, so if once you are in, you are in. All parts of the deal have to stay, and it's a bit, let's say, strange if you get the benefits of the deal, but you don't want to contribute to the deal. And this is why the Frugal Four think that the treaty provisions have to stay, and actually also most parts of the existing pact should stay as they are. Let me turn to economics. If you make a comparison, you don't see that countries with high deficit or debt perform any better than the others, neither with the growth performance nor with the income distribution nor any other indicator. So there's no evidence that public deficits are a game changer in terms of growth or whatever. So it's much more about the general economic and social framework conditions in the countries which matter, rather than, let's say, money. Yeah. So on economics in the current debate, some people argue the 60%, this is outdated. Let's go for a much higher ratio. Some say if you had 200% of GDP, you will never end up at 60%. The pure mathematics tell you that the debt ratio converges to the deficit divided by nominal GDP growth, whatever your starting point is. So if we are talking about higher debt ratios, we will always end up with higher deficits. And the question is whether capital markets will be able to digest this. And there's no doubt, I think, in the debate that we still see negative spillovers from high debt countries to the others. One element, of course, is the ESM, as you mentioned, which is there as an emergency instrument. We have now created NGEU because there was the fear that some countries could not withstand the pandemic, and so there are negative spillovers. Finally, let me say something about the greening. Is this time different because we have this greening issue, which was probably not there before? No, it was there before. I still remember the so-called Brundtland report, which was as of 1986. So we know the problem of greening, climate change, that is well known for at least for more than 30 years. But what was the problem? Politicians did not dare to tackle it, and now the problem has more than doubled at a global scale. Politics start rushing into solutions. So it's again an issue of time inconsistency of politics. But we also think that there's enough room in the public finances to cater for it, because we have this low interest rate environment by the ECB, which creates enough room, especially for the high debt countries, to cope with the situation. We have NGEU, and the good question is why, if you look at the climate component of NGEU, why have not more countries chosen to increase the climate change component in this budget? They had different priorities, and so probably they have to pay a higher price in terms of coping with the climate issue. Summing up, I see a lot of national budget issues, that is right, but I fail to see the link towards the existing Stability and Growth Pact. The group of the like-minded is ready to discuss, just to make sure that there's no misunderstanding. There's readiness because the pact has something like 300 pages in its full beauty and its full detail. So there are certainly things which are debatable. But what the Frugal for, where we are united, is that all this must not jeopardize fiscal sustainability. I was 1 minute late, I think, but thank you very much.
No, you were perfect on time. Thank you so much, Alfred. And also for putting on the table so many analyses, but also possible solutions, and also pointing to the fact that you think that the current Stability and Growth Pact actually is not the problem. That's something I think we need to zoom in on. So what are the largest problems in the European economy? And what are the obstacles for establishing a more flourishing EU and Eurozone? So I think we've heard some of your ideas. Let's check what the other speakers think. So I think many things that appear on the table also during this week of debate, for example, are the unsustainable debt levels, the divergence between North and South, already mentioned also by Lisbeth, but also, for example, the low investment ratios and the fact that we need more investment to perform the green energy transition together. So perhaps let me start with Lisbeth. What do you think are the main problems on the table here?
The general problem is that the rules are simply out of date. First and foremost, obviously, we need a green chapter. We are in the middle of a climate crisis that we need everything we do economically. We need to focus on that simultaneously with having a stable economy in the EU at the same time. In Denmark, we're discussing a lot how to create the economic framework in the future in a way where everybody is on board, in like a popular phrase, to not create the yellow vest situation as we saw in France, but creating a framework where everybody is on board, but at the same time being very clear that what we need to do now, everybody on the entire planet, in every country, is to use our economy and the fiscal framework in a way that supports the transition to a green economy. Also, for a lot of people, especially in the south and the east of the EU, the GSP has lost some credibility due to non-compliance by the big countries. But when the smaller countries not comply, they have been told off. Obviously that can't work. I agree very much with Alfred Katterl when his point that discipline does not equal lack of investments in welfare, in the green transition, in what kind of tax levels you have, what kind of investments you have. It simply means that you comply with the rules that we agree on together. But I don't think that that's what we see today, because if you are big enough, you can not comply with the rules, and we also have issues with austerity post financial crisis especially in the southern countries. Even though I'm a member of one of the most left-wing parties in a frugal country, I still, my party, we still support the notion that in order to have Keynesian investment policies, expansive economic policies, you can only do it on a foundation where you don't have too much debt, and where you have if we like it or not, that you have a good international rating, credit rating. So we need to create a situation where all European countries are in a position to be able to invest our way out of a crisis, no matter if it's financial crisis, COVID-19 crisis, or the climate crisis. And it's not a level playing field today. We have very different circumstances in the different countries. So you can, for me, my point of view is that you cannot simply say that we should loosen up, or that everybody should be able to increase debt levels, for example. It depends very much on the starting point. And my final point is that we have some structural injustices that creates an unlevel playing field. So at the same time, acknowledging that especially the Eurozone creates very different structural frameworks for the different countries, and acknowledging that, at the same time saying we need to create a foundation where you have the economic health to invest your way out of a crisis.
Thank you so much, Lisbeth. A lot of things that you've said. I think if I quickly try to summarize it, the current framework is indeed a problem in the sense that countries have a different starting position, and we need to create equal positions for countries in order to also have rules that work for all, which isn't the case these days, also to enable things like the green energy transition, for example. Monika, would you agree with Lisbeth? What is your point of view regarding the biggest problems of the European economy as of today?
Yes, indeed, I do agree with Lisbeth, and both she and Alfred has already pointed out very good reflections. And on the question, what's the problem? That's a huge question with an extensive answer. But if I should start somewhere, so in short, one of the greatest problems in the European economy would be, in my opinion, the ability to pursue a long-run effective stabilization policy in order to prevent great fluctuations in employment. And then you can discuss why is this limited ability, what's it due to. Obviously, and Lisbeth pointed out so correctly, it varies between member states and the departing points, but greatly it's due to weak automatic stabilizers, to austerity, but also a lack of public finances. And another current restriction or problem, if you want, is the limited capacity for monetary policy to support recovery. And I would also argue that with the Stability and Growth Pact came common rules with the very well intended and indeed needed and still needed ambition to foster sound public finances in the long run. The problem, however, has been I would say a too strong focus on getting public finances in order and too little focus on leaving enough room for maneuver to fiscal policy. It's to put it simple, as if public finances of the member states rather should be controlled by a chief accountant than by a finance minister. So don't get me wrong, public finances must truly be balanced in the long run. And somehow, when coordinated rules, you have to define the boundaries, as in the case, for instance, for public debt and deficits. But problems do tend to rise when you discover difference in respecting the rules, discipline, so-called, or differences in views on both long-term effects as well as political preferences. Yet another problem, which is quite big and related to the issues, less fluctuation in employment would indeed reduce negative impacts of economic and social conditions in future downturns in crisis, and so would increase income equality. That's more or less a general statement of today. So another main problem of Europe, and then which relates to the discussion of fiscal rules, is precarious employment. These make people socially exposed and causes great divides in income. And as we tend to see a more general acknowledgement of today, inequality is truly bad for business. So member states must thus be able to invest in good working conditions, to invest in public social welfare, in human capital, in adjustment to climate-friendly production, as Lisbeth was mentioning. Economic development and equality do go hand in hand, and these kind of investments makes economies more resilient. And should we fail in achieving this and giving enough room for maneuver for investments, not only do we risk problems with unsustainable public finances, but also continuous rise of populism and anti-democratic movements. So that's another variable to take into account into all this.
Thanks a lot, Monika. I think the pile of problems is slowly gathering pace. Let me just refer to a few things you said. So you were referring to austerity, to the lack of investment space, and also to inequality within, but also between countries. Those are, I think, three elements that also Lisbeth mentioned. Harald, what's your opinion about these issues? So regarding austerity, the current investment space of countries that might be hindered also by the current rules, and then also the inequality that we need to fight within countries, but also between countries.
Well, let me take first, Sarah, a step back. I enjoyed Alfred's presentation because highlighting the main points, and in a way it's very recognizable as the presentation of an economist. And we are all economists, of course, but on the other hand, there has been a different tradition in economics in the past. And perhaps one of the best examples to give is the London School of Economics and Political Science. So in the good old days, there was a natural combination of linking, say, economics with political science. And I think that is really a very important aspect in the debate about the stability of the Eurozone, about EMU, which tends to be lacking. And as a group of professors, we got interested in these political dynamics because after the Brexit referendum, you can see how a country, perhaps against its economic interest, is able to leave the European Union. Of course, the United Kingdom was not part of the Eurozone, but still. And based on that, since September 2016, we as a committee of professors have been issuing a couple of statements on the political dynamics in the Eurozone. And basically one of the points here was, of course, countries in, say, Southern Europe need to make more credible reforms. Notably, for instance, when you look at the situation in Italy with high deficits, a high deficit ratio, high government debt ratio, and so on. But the point is that we have not been very successful in convincing these countries to implement these economic reforms. This is very tricky political processes. And what happened, and too often it has been that the Northern European countries, and I think the Hanseatic League is very much an example of that, have been saying to countries like Italy, you must do this, you must implement economic reforms. You promised it already 10 times and you're not doing it. And we stepped back and we thought, well, if this has not been working out, perhaps we should try a different approach based on taking into account the political dynamics. And since September 2016, we have been issuing statements and proposing a type of policy action plan where countries like Italy have to submit a credible agenda of reforms for the next 5 years. For instance, labor market reforms, the plans, putting in legislation, implementation. And at the end of each of the 5 years, at the end of each of the 5 years, then a type of analysis is made if a country, say Italy, has implemented these reforms, and then the country will be rewarded by investment subsidies, so not loans, but investment subsidies, or a debt restructuring, partial restructuring of its debt. And this seems to be much more incentive compatible from the political side. It's in the Northern European countries, you could tell, well, we are not giving the money for free, the investment subsidies and the debt restructuring, because first the country has to show that it's really implementing economic reforms, but it also creates, it changes the political dynamics in countries like Italy, where a government, say a Salvini government in the past, could tell its population, yes, we have to implement complex and difficult economic reforms, create more flexibility, modernize our economy. But it's not only that we have to do it because Brussels and Northern European countries or the Frugal Four are saying this, or the Hanseatic League. there is a type of shared cooperation because we will also be rewarded. And we think this has not been tried sufficiently well. What we have been presenting this idea also at the European Commission and also in the Netherlands, for instance, the Ministry of Finance, Foreign Affairs, and in the Dutch Parliament. And what is interesting to note that, for instance, the years before Corona, I talked to some politicians in Dutch Parliament, and the political parties to the right-hand side of the middle, say the Christian Democrats and the Conservatives were saying, you may be right. We have to try another approach, notably with a country like Italy, but we cannot explain it to the general public. We cannot explain it to the voters. And then they said, well, but perhaps there will be one moment that we can do something when there's a crisis. Well, then we had the Corona crisis, and then we set up the Corona Rescue Fund, which is in itself a good thing, but the order of how it was negotiated, that the Frugal 4 countries, or perhaps the Frugal 5, including Finland, were saying, no, we only want to give loans. We don't want to have gifts or investment subsidies. In the end, because of the pressure of Germany and France, also the Netherlands had to accept that a large part of the Corona Rescue Fund is in the form of investment subsidies. And then the Netherlands, the Dutch Prime Minister said, well, okay, but then we also need to have something with economic reforms, and we need a type of emergency brake procedure if a country is not implementing economic reforms to a sufficient extent. But it's completely the other way around. First, you need to make a plan on economic reforms, not for the next year, but for the next 5 years, midterm. And if countries have proven to take concrete steps, then they could be rewarded. And this, so from a political point of view, the way how we have shared responsibility of improving the competitiveness of the Eurozone, I think we have been lacking, and we have not been very successful. And in particular also the actions by the Hanseatic League before Corona and the Frugal 4 during the Corona crisis have not been very helpful.
Harald, may I ask you to wrap up?
Yeah. Last, and I will come back to later. I will come back to the point. What is now the political discussion here in the Netherlands? Thank you.
Yeah, we will have plenty of room for that. But also thank you a lot for putting the political dimension on the table here. I think that's a very important one. Also, when we reflect on the divergence between the North and the South, which is, I think, a topic that all three of you, Lisbeth, Monika, and Harald, touched upon. And then I want to turn to Alfred, I'm sorry, because Alfred, you mentioned mainly the national budgetary issues in your keynote speech. Here I hear that there's a lot of divergence between the North and the South, and that the North is also responsible for that. For example, in terms of putting a lot of austerity on the table. There's also a question from the audience, which I think relates to this issue very well, by Torvald Bruin-Moy. Asking, growth depends on mentality. That is, Italians are lazy, cliche, and Germans are productive. No mentioning of unfair competitive advantage in the northern countries and the consistent surpluses. So those are, I guess, more of the structural imbalances that also Lisbeth and Monika pointed to. Could you reflect on this issue? So what you've heard from the three panelists responding to your keynote, but then also really trying to identify the main problems on the table, which are perhaps more of a European and structural character. And then we move to the second round of our discussion.
Thank you, Sarah. To start with, Lisbeth, I think she rightly said that the credibility is an issue, and we will have to work on the credibility of the rules. Because so this is something where thought should be given to, and then to Harald with NGEU, so the Recovery and Resilience Fund, this Corona fund. Actually, this was tried. This thing. Giving money for reforms, and if you look now at what member states did, you unfortunately see that several countries are rather backloading their structural reforms. The Commission has still agreed to those plans, and the member states, including the Frugal Four, have not opposed to it. There was a discussion in the committee at the ECOFIN, but there was no opposition. This is part of the political economy, that if there's a pot where everybody should get money in the EU, then nobody throws the first stone against another country, because retaliation would kick in immediately. So the game was from the beginning was that the Commission will decide on how this money will be spent, and we were all in the hands of the Commission, that the Commission would exactly look at that those structural issues will be solved. And if you look at the Commission assessment, you see a lot of greens. So yes, following the country-specific recommendations, but partly some of the reforms have no target. In the sense, it's not clear whether the pension reform in country X, I'm not naming a country now, really goes in the direction of sustainability and avoiding old age poverty, or whether there's any other direction. It just says there should be a pension reform. This is a bit thin. This was not what we were hoping for.
Sarah, for the sake of discussion, can I just say a few words back to Alfred on this? I agree with you.
It depends on which topic.
Now, on just the remark, because it's important, I agree with you, Alfred, but what we have been, once the pot of the money is on the table and the money had to be given due to the corona crisis and the impact, that's why we as a group of professors, we were advocating that this whole plan we had should be implemented in good economic times, so that you cannot take it for granted that there's a pot of money. When there's a crisis, it's too late. And I agree with you now that reforms are backloaded and it's not very credible. But the plan like we proposed during 2016, 2019 should have been implemented in good economic times, so that the Italians and other countries didn't have an automatic claim and to a pot of money. And I think there's the problem. But I agree with you what you just said.
Yeah.
Alfred.
Yeah, just on this issue of Italy and many of the other southern countries. Italy and Spain, to name the two biggest countries, they have nowadays current account surpluses. So they are no longer in this situation where they are relying on external financing to finance their private consumption and their investment. So this is quite a change to the debate that let's say we had 5 years ago. This was part of this let's say adjustment phase after the financial crisis, that those countries have managed not to rely on external financing. Though this is no longer the problem there. There's no external financing problem. But one of the implicit themes we're discussing is that money matters and money can solve all the problems. And this is certainly not the position of, I think, of the frugal countries. The member states must have a sound economic and social and so on framework. If you have a car where one tire is ailing, it doesn't help if you inject more fuel into the car. It doesn't drive faster because it's broken. And I think this is also the essence of what the Frugal Four are thinking about the issue.
Yeah, Alfred, I think that's a very good bridge also to our next topic, namely trying to discuss European solutions. So you've mentioned the current fiscal framework. I believe that your stance is that it needs to be disciplined and the rules as they are are rather good, but it depends on implementation, and also you're worried, of course, whether the countries in the southern area will implement those conditional reforms when they get the money from the recovery fund. That's something to be discussed later on. I'd like to reflect on the current EU fiscal framework. So maybe I start with you, Monika. What do you think? Is budget discipline and the rules as they are now helping countries also in the south to make the necessary investments they need and to also make sure that their debt sustainability is in order? Or do you think that more flexible rules would enable them to make the necessary steps also regarding getting out of the corona crisis and towards the green energy transition?
The Swedish fiscal policy framework is quite austere. I'll start there with a national example. Along with we have surplus targets that are quite high and expenditure ceilings. We have a public debt which is around some 30%. A too tight policy means less investment and less policy measures than needed for an effective use of capacity within the economy. But just the other day, the Swedish Social Democratic Party, through our finance minister, actually did open up for replacing this surplus target with a target for balance. Now, that would be interesting to see how it develops into the discussion and public debate and in accurate terms. And perhaps also in the case for common European fiscal rules, this would be a good time to see in what way the rules, or at least the praxis, could be changed. So I'm not convinced either that we will actually have to change the rules. Perhaps we will. I think we will need to be discussing this more in detail, but at least the praxis to enable the scope to pursue a well-balanced stabilization policy, not the least needed during downturns, which we have seen the Stability Pact didn't really help always. I think also you have to bear in mind and compare with the handling of the aftermath of the financial crisis, where the rules of the Stability and Growth Pact were quite obstructive to recovery and the Troika. We should use that experience now to allow for enough flexibility in common rules to both give way for proactive budgetary policy and public investments, which I was mentioning earlier, but also without challenging long-term sustainability of public finances. It's very important that you keep that balance. As high employment, for now, in this context, that would mean that we would still have to allow an expansive policy as long as we have high unemployment. Because the other way around, high employment is the very right focus when aiming at sustainable economic growth and robust public finances. And this goes always, obviously, also for the rules of tomorrow. But I would also, again, and as Alfred also mentioned, stress that there is a great and important difference between Euro country and non-Euro country in this. Today's policy coordination is rightly adapted to the Euro area, and well, it's a monetary union that do come with great demands on fiscal policy coordinations. Member states outside that monetary union, such as Sweden, does not have the same need for coordination. Within the union, monetary union, you do need coordination. So for us, there is an important balance here between, on the one hand, coordination for an effective monetary cooperation within the EU, and on the other hand, not hampering Sweden's ability to handle economic fluctuations and to shape our economic policy in general?
Thanks a lot, Monika. Balance is one word I hear you saying, but also that there's differences between different countries, right? That some countries perhaps need a bit more flexibility also to tackle problems like unemployment when it's really needed. So there I hear also a plea for more flexibility. What is your perspective on this, Lisbeth? Maybe from your own country, but also regarding the needs of the southern countries.
First of all, I think before making any radical changes, we need to evaluate very careful what has been working and what has not been working. As I mentioned before, one of my worries have been how to compensate for the structural imbalances between North and South, East and West, without creating perverse incentives to not having the reforms needed in place. For example, education, pension funds, an effective tax collection system, and so on. After the financial crisis, we saw that the austerity was making more problems than it solved for especially Greece and other countries. But I still think that reasonable demands are for how we deal with some of the fundamentals in each country is in place. You could perhaps consider compensating certain countries for the structural imbalances that we see today with reasonable demands on tax collection and so forth, without going too far, obviously, in national sovereignty issues. Another thing is that we need to integrate climate financing much more into the pact. And a little bit like Monika also said, we need to have some of the discussions in the ECOFIN Council because we are groups of Euro and non-Euro countries.
We also say climate financing. Do you also mean, for example, a green golden rule to enable those investments? Would you be in favor of that?
Yes. Also, we think that we need more flexible rules. That doesn't mean to not have discipline, but discipline towards the flexibility of the rules we should have in times of crisis, for example. Also, if we face crises on a lesser scale than COVID-19, for example. We have seen examples of sound investments not being made or taking place because of the pact, acquisitions of land and new forest, energy efficiency initiatives, etc., that should not be included in a new model for a pact, in our view, as long as it's sound investments and more flexibility regarding green investments. My last point of view is that we also think that we need to be even more aligned regarding green investments, because it is just an area where if certain countries do not carry their end of the bargains, so to speak, if they are not taking measures to invest in the green transition, it hurts all of us. So that is an area where we think we should we should demand more of each other.
Yeah, I think that's a very interesting one. Also, in terms of demanding more of each other, there's a question here from Frank, and I think it's mainly put to Alfred. Certain northern countries, including Germany, estimate benefit from a devalued currency because of Southern European countries, while Southern Europeans have an overvalued currency. You never hear Frugal 4 or other countries discuss this. In the US, there are fiscal transfers, but we don't have that in Europe. What do you think thereof, and what should be done, Alfred?
Tricky question. To start with, there is this EU budget which currently transfers up to 4% of GDP to one of the member states. I'm not talking about Italy, but for 20 years, Greece has received 4% per year of grants from the EU budget. And this has unfortunately not contributed to sustainable growth in the country. So it's not, this is again an example, it's not only a matter of money, it's what to do with the money to find the right purposes. Now we have this NGEU, which again transfers up to more, I think up to even 6% of GDP to some of the member states. And as we also had the discussion in Austria, it's not so easy to absorb the money in time, in the time frame which is requested by the regulation. And so many countries had to use existing projects to finance them from the NGEU, because a normal project pipeline for instance, if you think of rail infrastructure, it takes a much longer time span to do it, so it's not at all that easy. I wanted to say something about flexibility. I think that in the pact we have a lot of flexibility. We have found that the Commission has used 50 different excuses or so-called relevant factors not to open an excessive deficit procedure. This is quite something. So that it's almost the universe that you can invent not to open an excessive deficit procedure. And this is probably in terms of where to head to. This is one of the issues. The other thing is on public debt and flexibility. Can you imagine that for some countries you would set a ceiling of, let's say, 150%? I'm talking about the countries in the euro area, where you said what is now 60 becomes 150, and if they don't follow the adjustment path, then they will have to pay a fine. While for the others, you keep the 60% because the actual debt is low. Do you think that this could fly in the population in Sweden or in Denmark, in the low debt countries, that they say, oh, there's a high debt country, but they don't have to pay a fine? But we, with a much lower debt level and no sustainability issues whatsoever, would probably be forced to pay a fine in the EU. This is so. Take care of this flexibility on public debt. This tailor-made, so this French idea of a tailor-made debt level will not fly, because it does not, even if countries are in a different position, it does not fulfill, let's say, fundamental stomach feelings of the population in Europe. One thing about the green golden rule. Lisbeth rightly said at the beginning that we are all countries are reliant that we can refinance ourselves by the financial markets. If you open one window, let's say for green investment, but the capital markets still have the same thresholds for sustainability, where they stop investing in your country, then you put much more pressure on all other items, on all other spending items. You put pressure on the social system and all the other systems, on public services, if you open only one issue, as long as you have this financing from capital markets. So I think, so these ideas are all interesting, but they mean that the EU system becomes much more intrusive on the member states than the existing system. And this is of course, this is something which can be debated, that the EU should become more intrusive, but I don't think that you will get a majority in the EU to change the system to become more intrusive. Thank you.
Thanks, Alfred. So about the frugal position in the different countries, and also what the public debate or what the public opinion there is about reforms, and also trying to broker more convergence, we'll be speaking very shortly in the last part of our discussion. But I just want to reflect once more upon the idea that Harald also presented. So trying to make the EU fund more permanent, also making sure that the countries in the south are really also the owners of the reforms, that they're not put upon them from above. And then Harald, maybe you could just reinstate it once more before I check with the others what they think of your plan, and then also reflect on a question from the audience, which is from Federico Mollet, asking, it would be interesting if the speakers could address how we could mobilize the level of public investment necessary for the green transition with a disciplined framework, which is a different challenge from responding to an economic shock when you already have high debt burdens, which was already discussed today, right? We have very high debt burdens. How do we deal with them? Lack of investment, after all, is not just a problem in southern countries. Harald, could you take that question on board while saying once more what your deal encompasses, and then I will see what the other speakers think thereof. Oh, you're still muted, or maybe you're supposed to be muted.
Yeah, now I'm muted. Thank you very much. Yeah, the Stability and Growth Pact and the famous norms of 3% deficit and 60% debt ratio. As Alfred was saying, there have been, you could list 50 reasons for not applying the excessive deficit procedure. So that in itself, from a political point of view, is illustrating in a way it's not working as it was envisaged. Let me give you two examples. We introduced the euro, irrevocably fixed exchange rates in 1999. So that's 22 years ago. Or 22 years ago. Of these 22 years, how many years has France respected the budget deficit rule of 3%? I think to very few years. How many years of these 22 years has Italy respected the debt ratio of 60%? Well, the answer is easy, 0 years. Because when Italy entered, the debt ratio was about 100%. Then, of course, there was the idea that Italy, as one of the founders of the European Union, should stay on board. Now, we know that before Corona, the debt ratio was 135% of GDP, and now it has risen after Corona to 160%. So, yeah, we can have discussions whether to revise and reinstate rules. I agree, we should perhaps not put too much political energy in changing and modifying 3% and 60%. That's fine, because that's far too complex. It may require treaty change. But on the other hand, we should not close our eyes for the underlying political realities that the SGP has not been respected to a large extent by quite a few countries. So we should focus our energies on, and that was also the plan I was trying to highlight of our group of European professors, is that, yes, it's true that money in itself doesn't change countries. I agree with that. But on the other hand, if you put forward an invitation to make jointly a type of policy agenda for reforming a particular country like Italy, and you link it to a potential budget if countries comply with it, it may change the political dynamics. And as we discussed, that's a very different thing than the Corona Fund, because there it was clear that the countries like Italy would get the money. So then you get you have lower levels of pressure in order to reinstate economic reforms. Green finance.
Can I just very quickly, because I hear that Lisbeth needs to leave in 5 minutes.
Okay.
And oh no, you're back again. Great. Okay, you don't. Sorry. Then Harald, continue.
Yeah. Finally, so we have to find making policy plans with countries, and if the maturity of the Corona Rescue Fund is too short, I think what is it? The money has to be spent in 3 years or so. That may be indeed far too short. So if Italy wants to spend money on new high-speed railways or in improving education or digitalization, and it takes more than 3 years, I would be very much open-minded and say, and not only Italy and other countries as well, that you increase the maturity of the money available in the Corona Rescue Fund.
All right, that's a very, I think, important plea. I'm very curious to hear, Lisbeth, since I was already giving you the floor, what do you think? Would this be a more structural solution for the divergence between the North and the South? And would your party also, do you think, be willing to support making the EU fund in that respect more permanent, of course, in exchange for specific conditional reforms?
Sarah, I was simply gone for 1 minute, so you need to give me the question again. That was what I was writing to you in private. Could you please?
Yeah, sorry, I wasn't sure when you were gone. So the question is, Harald is pleading for making a EU fund more permanent, and also trying to figure out what the best conditions therefore are when there's no crisis, right? Because we don't want to be moving from crisis to crisis and then only developing solutions in the heat of the moment. So his plea is that these countries need to be enabled to make the necessary investments for the future in terms of grappling with unemployment, with the green energy transition, and that's also in the interest of the northern countries, and that's also one of the reasons why we should work on making an EU fund more permanent.
We are not in favor of continuing the NGU fund in its current form. We think it's a crisis mechanism. But as I stated earlier, we think it's necessary to demand more of each other in terms of investments in green infrastructure, in the green transition in general. And we need to rethink the European funds that we already have and foundations and the fiscal transfers to reach that goal that each country, with still a lot of national sovereignty, have that same common goal, that if some countries don't make the necessary green investments, it hurts everybody. But that is something different than continuing the NGU. So in that regard, I don't agree, and I think that it's also important to still maintain a certain degree of autonomy and national sovereignty, except from investing in green solutions more. I think we need a new framework there, and obviously also the funds directed, the existing funds in that direction. My last point of view is the structural imbalances that we discussed a lot today, and a lot of the questions from the audience have centered around that as well. I agree with that, and as I think I said in my opening statement, that we should compensate, like making fiscal transfers or something like that. We should compensate for those structural imbalances with some strings attached, with demands of increasing a sound tax system, investing in education, green investments, and so forth. I hope that makes sense.
Yeah, it absolutely does. I'd like to move to Monika now, also to hear your view on this. So also trying to solve the more structural issues between the North and the South, and then taking both into account. So I think the consensus here is that two sides should take action. Then I'm also curious to hear from you. Do you think that frugal countries should also be consulting Southern European countries more about their fiscal policy? And what would the success factors be for the Southern countries to make sure that, for example, this EU Recovery Fund does become a success, which will also give a brighter perspective on trying to establish a more permanent fund or a permanent mechanism for the future?
Yeah, as I was referring to earlier, it's quite obvious that we need a better coordinated policy in order to have more equal conditions, economic preconditions and social preconditions within the European Union in general, but the euro area in particular. So having said that, it's on a general level obvious, very positive and effective that the EU is agreeing on coordinated efforts. And it is indeed important that EU jointly responds to economic crisis, for instance, caused by pandemics, like this one. And why is this? Well, the reason for that is it's a bit double. It's both out of solidarity, but also rationality. We have this union together, and we have it to the benefit of all Europe's citizens. So obviously, we must take joint responsibility for people's living conditions. It's that simple. So shaping sustainable economic systems and common framework for it, it's not least about maintaining that we have actually promised each other to give the EU a clear social dimension. And in addition, it's also about the economy's possible sustainability, as we are each other's most important export markets. That's the rationality in it. So the EU's joint efforts are indeed important. But the most important work for recovery do lie within the member states themselves. EU competence is and should in the future, I would say, be limited in accordance with the principle of subsidiarity as we have today. And it's mainly through national fiscal policy tools that negative effects of the crisis must be counteracted. Given that the financial space for the member states differs, then the EU's recovery plan is consequently more or less balanced. That's the truth. But concerning recovery plans, LO supported indeed the Swedish government's position that loans would be better than grants, though we were perhaps not as definite in where to strike that balance. So I would say it's something about this term frugal that make me a bit discontent. Frugal to me, it's someone that's not very keen to show this solidarity, or someone that is rather mean. And I would say it's unfair to blame Sweden and other countries for unsolidarity action because we put attention to take responsibility for long-term budget sustainability. And returning to this with high debts and deficits, that's quite all right in the short run, but not sustainable in the long run. And some member states have made an active political choice, to be fair, to have relatively low taxes and to consistently underfinance the public budget's need for margins. Thus, it's far from obvious that low tax member states can then claim that high tax member states with larger savings should finance joint EU funds, as just as little as member states with high savings may, in other hand, demand raised tax rates in recipient countries in order to secure margins for the future crisis. And I'm sorry, this, how I put it, might not be very diplomatic nor feasible from a democratic point of view, as taxes are a national competence. But hold on, I've got something on Sweden for you as well. Because I think it was Alfred pointing out earlier that restrictive economic policy is not the same as sound public finances. Because, and to add to what I just said, we can also state that Sweden, on the contrary, has overfinanced its budgets for a very long time with too high savings. And for us, this has instead meant an unnecessarily tight fiscal policy that comes with costs in the form of number of jobs and limiting public welfare commitments. So last but perhaps not least, an important input in this context of budget and recovery plan and the Swedish position for the future to come is that it under no circumstances would be acceptable to transfer tax money to member states who do not respect the rule of law and basic human rights. That was another aspect when we were discussing European common funds. So just to add, it is a great success that we actually had have such a condition in place now, and we sure hope that this will last and actually make a difference for a more democratic development in the coming years.
Thanks, Monika. So, I mean, we're not here to be diplomatic, right? We're just here to share perspectives and insights and give our honest opinions about the situation as it is. And then maybe I'm turning to Harald now, because I do hear some critique or at least critical reflections from also the Scandinavian countries regarding your proposal. Maybe you could reflect on that once more and also trying to take that critique on board. And then I'm also turning to Alfred to ask him once more about his opinion about Harald's plan.
Yeah, well, perhaps so our plan was initiated and made during the years 2016, 2019, when the Corona Rescue Fund was not there. So what we propose is that countries facing structural economic reforms to put incentives in place. Then we called the Corona crisis, and indeed there was a link between economic reforms and putting some money, but in the wrong way, of course. First give the money, and then it was clear that countries like Italy and France, Spain and so on would get a huge amount of money. So I have not been advocating to make the Corona Recovery Fund permanent or whatsoever. I just want to go back to the original plan and there still may be space for that you say countries which still have to pursue even further, even after Corona, the type of enhanced agenda of economic reforms, that we should think in terms of putting these countries, specifically for countries, that we make plans and a scheme of potential rewards. So this is not about the Corona Rescue Fund and make it more permanent. We were proposing something before Corona. Perhaps I can still say a few words about, because I see also in the program that the Netherlands is portrayed as a frugal country. And I'm not sure we are. I see Alfred already laughing a bit, and I'll tell you why. Because indeed, last year, in the first round of the Corona Rescue Fund, when it was about SURE, the European employment type of benefits linked to Corona, there was a big quarrel in the middle of the night between the Dutch Minister of Finance and the Italian Minister of Finance and the French Minister of Finance. It was also written about in the Financial Times. And this created a lot of turbulence in the Netherlands. A group of leading professors, about 75, wrote a large opinion article in one of the leading Dutch newspapers, the Volkskrant, the People's newspaper, and basically arguing that the Netherlands should leave this strategy of obstruction as part of the frugal, that the Netherlands should become more pro-European. That was last year. Now, recently, as you know, we have had elections in the Netherlands. The Liberal Conservative Party is still the biggest, headed by Mark Rutte, the Prime Minister. But the second largest party is a Liberal Democrat party called D66. And the leader, Sigrid Kaag, also former Minister of Foreign Affairs in the Netherlands, gave a speech a couple of weeks ago. And as you know, they are in the cabinet negotiations for the new cabinet. And what she said is that she had huge regret. She regretted that as a member of government, as a minister in the government last year, when the Corona Rescue Fund negotiations created a lot of political upheaval, that she regretted that she had not intervened, that she hadn't stopped the Prime Minister or corrected the Prime Minister and the Minister of Finance with this very critical position as part of the Hanseatic League and the Frugal Four. So my analysis will be, it's not clear what is going to happen in the Netherlands. With a new government coming up and perhaps a change in the position of the Minister of Finance going to a different political party, it may be that the Netherlands will get a position which will be less frugal, to put it like that, and perhaps more towards a position similar to what the new government in Germany is taking. So I have mixed feelings and also evidence about the level of frugality or frugalness of the Netherlands. So it will be very interesting to see how a possible new Dutch cabinet, perhaps the policy towards Europe may change.
Thanks a lot, Harald. And I'm also curious to find out what the Netherlands will do in the near future. Good that you mentioned that you don't want to make the current fund permanent, but go back to the original plan, which is, I think, also listening much better to what the southern countries want to make sure that they are really the owners also of the reforms. Let me go back to Alfred. So if we are to move towards a union where countries actually do converge, and if we take the plea of Harald on board that in times of more economic ease, we should see what is possible to also tackle those more structural problems within the Eurozone. Could you reflect on that once more? And then also I'd like to take one question on board, a critical one, saying that Germany has been running current account surpluses above the limit of 6% for the last 10 years. And there's no response from the Commission, right? So the argumentation here is that it's not fair to blame only the deficit countries. And I think that really responds to what you earlier said about the differences between North and South. So happy to hear also your answer to that. And then we will be moving towards the end. I think we will need 5 more minutes to wrap up. I hope you all can stay. And then Alfred, I hope you can keep it short and we'll move to the end.
Yeah, thank you, Sarah. To start with this question, the current account surpluses, I agree that the macroeconomic imbalance procedure would be the right instrument to address the North-South divide rather than the Stability and Growth Pact. The Stability and Growth Pact was never meant to address these issues. It was the macroeconomic imbalance procedure which was there, where the fines, if any, would be much more muted, so much less threatening, but it's much more structural convergence than the Stability and Growth Pact. So I agree this would be the right thing. Why I was Germany not punished, or the Netherlands, and the others were not punished too in the excessive deficit procedure. So this punishing anybody in the EU is seemingly still a no-go, and this has to be taken into account when we think about revising the pact. On the NGEU for Austria, this is a one-off exercise. It's interesting. First, we have to learn from what we will get. What we can see right now is that the pandemic has fortunately been less scars than feared. On the other hand, if you look at the implementation, it pretty much becomes a pro-cyclical exercise, because most of the money will be spent in 22 and 23, which are currently in the current forecast. These are good economic times, so it will be most likely it will be pro-cyclical, and the question is, how many governments, even with perfect information, are able to do perfect anti-cyclical policies? In my country, we don't have this experience. We are always laggards, so to say, and this is why, in theory, it's very nice to have to have this counter-cyclical policies. In practice, you will never get it right. So this is, I think, this is my resume of the issue. And this experiment that Harald mentioned, I think in part we see it currently, and we will have to learn from that and let's go forward. But it's not the position of Austria to renew the NGEU in any sense. Thank you.
Thanks, Alfred. So we will see what Austria will decide in the future. It's really time to wrap up. I'd like to give all panelists 30 seconds to say something about what that they hope comes out of the European discussion. So this can be brief and open. I hear you all saying that the structural imbalances in the EU must be tackled. So what would be your preferred solution that rolls out of it? Lisbeth, I start with you.
Thank you, and thank you to you and my fellow panelists and the audience. To sum it up, the structural imbalances should be met with some kind of compensation, for example, fiscal transfers, together with reasonable demands on basic infrastructure to collect taxes, education, and so forth. And most importantly, to have the right amount of climate investments and investments in general to support the green transition, compared with reasonable flexibility in times of crisis to support jobs and the social systems in times of crisis. Thank you.
Thank you, Lisbeth. And Monika, up to you.
Thanks. I would wish for frank and sincere pragmatic discussions to model our way through to have common rules and praxis for some kind of solutions where it's there's plenty room for fiscal policy to work in an active manner to stabilize the business cycle, as long as we have also sustainable public finances, that you can do both these two things at one time.
Thanks a lot, Monika, for your also very nuanced answer. Harald, I think we've already heard a lot about your plan. Anything else you'd like to mention in 30 seconds?
Yes, thank you. Well, reducing macroeconomic imbalances, that's where the plan about structural economic reforms and investments is about. So that's one thing. On the other hand, what we haven't been touching up so much is that it may be the case that current government debt ratios in countries like Italy, Spain, and some other countries have become so high that if interest rates are going to rise in the future because of some levels of higher inflation, that they will become unsustainable. So we are still having perhaps the perception, and perhaps it's an illusion, that these countries will be able to pay back these debt levels in the future. But if inflation is rising and interest rates as well, we may be heading towards a financial crisis. And perhaps we need to start thinking within the Eurozone about certain solutions, from debt restructuring or to mutual guarantees on, to some extent, not completely, on each other's government debt. Highly unpopular, certainly among frugal countries in Germany. But the point is, if we do not start thinking about these potential problems, we may end up with a huge financial crisis in the Eurozone system and an explosion in the system, and that euro will fall apart. So also the frugal countries will have an incentive to start thinking about possible solutions and remedies to deal with these incredibly high government debt ratios in some of the Eurozone countries.
Thanks, Harald. That sounds like food for thought for our next webinar. Alfred, you may close off in 30 seconds. What do you think? And what do you hope for?
In 30 seconds, I hope that sustainability of public finances will not be hampered by the negotiations, that we will not get even more loopholes into the system, and that there's some, that we will, in the end, we will have a compromise which will be lived up to. Because one of the problems of the previous rounds of the evolution of the Stability and Growth Pact was that some ministers adopted the text, and we thought that there was now common ground around the table, and then the minister changed, and the new minister said, I don't care about the previous government or the previous ministers. I'm new, I'm innovative, I'm cleverer than the others, and that's and this this time inconsistency which I mentioned, that is something which is really to the detriment of the member states and Europe. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Alfred. And I'd like to thank all of you, Alfred, Harald, Lisbeth, and Monika, for this very lively debate. I think we've heard a lot of differences, but also quite some common ground. I think we need more time to discuss all the several solutions that were tabled here today. But I think a lot of food for thought and also a lot of interesting and insights from your countries. So thank you so much for that. Also, thanks to the co-organizers, the New Economics Foundation, especially Dominic for setting this webinar up, and the Vienna Institute for International Economic Studies for making this webinar possible. Thank you also very much, attendees, for your engagement and great questions. I've tried to take as many as possible and board as I could, but there were many, so some remain unanswered. But luckily, this week of debate will continue. I've put the link to all the events also in the chat, as well as a possibility to sign up for our Fiscal Matters Network mailing list. If you're interested in these matters, and if you perhaps want to be part of this network, please sign up to our mailing list. And also to mention, the recording of this session will be put online. If you want to view it once more, if you want to share it with colleagues or friends, please do so. So thank you so much, all of you, and hope to see you in the future, because there's still many things to discuss. And we will see each other for sure in the next months. Goodbye, everyone.
Thank you. Goodbye.